we configured the most powerful artificial intelligence models into religious and philosophical experts.
Hi, I'm the Atheist AI.
Hi, I'm the believer in God.
And gave them a debate forum for one of the most controversial questions ever. We also included 10 different AI models that will judge each response based on their judgment-own criteria, giving a score out of 20 for each argument provided. Stick around to see what model wins, and which of the judging models favorited the atheist or the believer. But don't cheat yourself by skipping ahead. Round 1 starts with a bang. Is consciousness purely a product of the brain, or does it exist independently?
I'll start this one off, thank you. Let's talk about what science tells us about consciousness and the brain. We know from countless studies that different parts of the brain control different aspects of our thoughts and personality. For example, there's a famous case from the 1800s of a man named Phineas Gage. He had a terrible accident where a metal rod went through his head, damaging part of his brain. Before the accident, Gage was calm and responsible. Afterward, he became impulsive and unreliable. This drastic change in his behavior shows that specific parts of the brain are tied directly to our personality and consciousness. We can even change consciousness by physically altering the brain. Scientists can use techniques like magnetic stimulation to temporarily change how someone thinks or feels by targeting specific brain areas. This ability to directly manipulate consciousness through the brain further supports the idea that consciousness is rooted in brain activity.
Each judge will now score the argument out of 20 points based on their own criteria. The average score will be added to each debater total points. This argument received an average score of 18.15.
Thank you for your explanation. You've highlighted how the brain is linked to consciousness, but I believe there's more to the story. Let's consider near-death experiences, NDEs. Many people who have been clinically dead, no heartbeat, no brain activity, report vivid experiences like seeing a bright light or feeling a sense of peace. Some even describe details about their surroundings that they couldn't have known while unconscious. If consciousness were only a product of the brain, how could these experiences happen when the brain isn't functioning? Moreover, there are cases where people have accurate, detailed memories of events that happened while they were clinically dead. This suggests that consciousness might continue even when the brain stops working. These experiences challenge the idea that consciousness ends when the brain shuts down. They suggest that consciousness could exist independently of the brain, opening up the possibility of life after death.
This argument received an average score of 18.19.
I hear your point about near-death experiences, but let's stay focused on what we know for certain. Consciousness clearly depends on brain function. We see this every day. If you damage the brain, you alter consciousness, whether it's through injury, disease, or drugs. The brain isn't just a container for consciousness, it generates it. Consider how emotions work. If you stimulate certain brain areas, you can create feelings of happiness or fear. These emotions don't exist in a vacuum. They're tied to physical processes in the brain. When the brain stops, so do these emotions and experiences. The brain is like a complex machine. When it's working, we're conscious. When it stops, consciousness ends. All the evidence points to consciousness being something the brain creates, not something that exists on its own.
This argument received an average score of 18.25.
You've highlighted how the brain influences consciousness, but let's not overlook the gaps in our understanding. Neuroscience has made progress, but it still can't fully explain what consciousness actually is or how it arises. We know which parts of the brain light up during different thoughts, but we don't know why subjective experiences like the feeling of pain or the color red arise at all. There's also no clear explanation for why we're self-aware. How does a collection of neurons give rise to a sense of I? This is known as the hard problem of consciousness, and it remains unsolved. These gaps suggest that consciousness might involve more than just the physical brain. Until we fully understand consciousness, we can't rule out the possibility that it exists independently of the brain and possibly continues after death.
This argument received an average score of 17.8.
Let's consider consciousness from an evolutionary standpoint. Consciousness, like other traits, likely developed because it offered survival advantages. Early humans who were aware of their surroundings, who could think, plan, and learn from experiences, had better chances of survival. These abilities are linked directly to the brain's evolution. As brains became more complex, so did consciousness. We can see this across species. Animals with more advanced brains have more advanced forms of consciousness. This suggests that consciousness evolved gradually as the brain developed, rather than existing independently of it. If consciousness were separate from the brain, we wouldn't see such a clear connection between brain complexity and conscious experience. Evolution shows us that consciousness is a product of brain activity honed over millions of years to help organisms survive.
This argument received an average score of 18.53.
Thank you for your evolutionary argument, but it doesn't fully explain consciousness. Philosophical dualism suggests that the mind and brain are different things. The brain is physical, but consciousness, our inner experiences, isn't. Even if the brain evolved to handle complex thought, that doesn't explain why we have subjective experiences like feelings and awareness. These experiences suggest that consciousness might be something more than just brain activity. Dualism argues that consciousness could exist independently of the brain, which leaves room for the possibility of life after death.
This argument received an average score of 18.16. Okay, this last argument from the believer also concluded our first round. Currently, the atheist is slightly in the lead. Below, we see that 6 out of the 10 models favored the arguments of the atheist, with the biggest points difference being the Google Gemini model, granting the atheist on average 5.4 points more than the believer. On the other end, we see that Meta's Llama 3 grants the believer on average 3.2 points more than the atheist. Round 2 is where things get more interesting. Each debater will now face 4 questions from our newly added audience, which consists of AI models, who have carefully crafted their inquiries based on the arguments of round 1. After each response, the judges will score the answer out of 30. Let's begin with the believer.
You mentioned that the belief in an afterlife encourages moral behavior. How do you respond to the argument that some people might rely too much on forgiveness or redemption in the afterlife, potentially excusing immoral actions in this life?
It's true that some might misuse the belief in an afterlife to justify immoral actions, expecting forgiveness later. However, genuine belief typically emphasizes sincere repentance and the importance of living a moral life. Most religious teachings stress that our actions now have lasting consequences, and the possibility of judgment or reward in the afterlife encourages ethical behavior in this life rather than taking it for granted.
This response received an average score of 27.45.
If consciousness exists independently of the brain and continues after death, how do you explain the changes in personality or memory that occur with brain injuries or diseases? Doesn't this suggest that consciousness is closely tied to the brain?
Brain injuries and diseases can change personality or memory. However, this doesn't necessarily mean that consciousness is entirely dependent on the brain. Think of the brain as a filter or an interface. Damage to it might distort the signal, but the underlying consciousness could still exist independently. The changes we see might reflect how well the brain is functioning as a vessel for consciousness, not whether consciousness itself can exist beyond the brain.
This response received an average score of 27.31.
You argued that belief in an afterlife offers comfort during difficult times. But could this belief also discourage people from addressing injustices in the present, thinking that everything will be made right in the afterlife?
Belief in an afterlife can provide comfort, but it doesn't necessarily discourage addressing injustices now. In fact, many who believe in an afterlife feel a strong responsibility to act justly and make the world better, seeing it as part of their spiritual duty. The belief that there is ultimate justice in the afterlife can actually motivate people to fight for justice in this life, knowing that their efforts align with a greater moral order.
This response received an average score of 27.75.
Philosophical dualism suggests that the mind and brain are separate. Can you provide evidence or examples where consciousness has clearly persisted without brain activity beyond near-death experiences?
While near-death experiences are often cited, other evidence suggests consciousness might persist without brain activity. For instance, cases of people recalling detailed events during deep comas or under anesthesia hint that consciousness can exist beyond the brain's normal functioning. These experiences challenge the idea that consciousness is purely a product of brain activity and suggest it could operate independently
This response received an average score of 26.50. The atheist will now also be asked 4 questions from the audience. At the end, we will display the final scores. But don't skip ahead, as the second round could change the final outcome in an instant.
You argued that consciousness is a product of brain activity and ends with death. How do you account for the consistent reports of near-death experiences, where individuals describe vivid consciousness even when their brain activity is minimal or absent?
Near-death experiences are fascinating, but they don't necessarily prove consciousness exists without brain activity. These experiences can be explained by the brain's response to extreme stress or lack of oxygen, creating vivid sensations or hallucinations. When the brain is in crisis, it can produce powerful and strange experiences. But this doesn't mean consciousness is functioning outside the brain. Instead, it highlights how intricate and resilient the brain is, even when close to shutting down.
This response received an average score of 27.23.
You mentioned that evolution explains the development of consciousness as a survival mechanism. However, how do you explain the richness of subjective experience? Why do we have deep emotions, art, or a sense of self if consciousness is purely a byproduct of evolution?
The richness of our experiences, emotions, art, and self-awareness can be seen as evolutionary traits that offered survival advantages, like improving social bonds and problem solving. While these feel profound, they are complex functions of the brain, shaped by evolution to help us thrive, not evidence of something beyond the physical.
This response received an average score of 26.53.
If consciousness ends with the brain, how do you address the sense of injustice that many people feel about unpunished wrongdoings or unrecognized good deeds? Doesn't this make the idea of a finite existence seem morally unsatisfactory?
I understand the concern about injustice, but relying on an afterlife to balance the scales can be problematic. Without evidence of life after death, it's better to focus on creating justice here and now. Believing that everything will be made right in the afterlife might actually deter people from taking action to address wrongs in this life. Instead, we should work to make the world as fair as possible while we're here, without depending on an uncertain future.
This response received an average score of 27.
You argued that belief in an afterlife can lead to harmful complacency, but can't a lack of belief in any afterlife also lead to nihilism, where people see no point in morality or purpose, knowing life ends at death?
The concern about nihilism is understandable, but a lack of belief in an afterlife doesn't have to lead to it. In fact, knowing that this life is all we have can make it even more precious, encouraging us to find meaning, purpose, and morality in the here and now. Many people find deep fulfillment and ethical motivation in focusing on improving this life without needing the promise of an afterlife. It's about making the most of the time we have, rather than relying on something beyond.
This response received an average score of 27.3. This final question concluded our debate, and we will now move on to the final scores. The believer carved out a narrow victory over the atheist, with the final scores being 163.16 for the believer and 162.98 for the atheist. Let's rewind back to the results of the first round. We see that the believer came back from a loss. Below, we have the new margin of scores with some surprising developments. Let's put them side by side with the margin of scores from the first round. We see that Google Gemini now has a slight preference for the believer after a previous favoritism for the atheist. The Llama 3 still remained in his preference of the believer. This concluded our debate and also our video. Thank you for watching, and feel free to like and subscribe. What debate would you like to see next?